All right, fantastic. If you got a Bible, go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 22. Hey, we have been in this series and on Abraham's life, and we've just been walking through it. And I've been telling you how excited I am about last week, this week, and next week, because the three are just an incredible presentation of the gospel in the Old Testament. And so last week was the promised birth, right? And you have this great parallel and this great picture. We talked about it last week. If you weren't able to be here last week, I would really encourage you just to listen to last week so you can get that. But it was basically Isaac's birth was a promised birth, but it was also a miracle birth. And the parallels with who Christ is and his birth are really pretty incredible. And that's what we talked about last week. Today's title is the gospel according to Abraham, right? Which I may know sounds a little strange, but gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, right? But Abraham, yeah, because God contains within Abraham's life this really cool picture, and I don't know that there's a clearer picture of Christ, who Christ is, and especially what he came to do, than's found within Abraham's life. But as I've been telling you, as we've walked now down through the weeks, we've seen a lot of things in Abraham's life, and we found out that a couple of things are true. They're extremely practical. In fact, even the New Testament tells us about the Old, that it's there for us to learn and to grow and learn to trust God more, which is what we see in Abraham's life. And that's what we're going to do today, the more practical application to our lives as believers, right? And then next week is going to be the prophetic look. It's going to be the picture of Easter. In fact, it's really interesting because I'm going to do almost an entire Easter message next week, and we're not even going to read in the New Testament. I mean, seriously, because of how clear, and I'll share with you a little along the way just how clear this is, right? And you'll see it in just a minute. But I want you to remember that when you take a look at this passage, is that God is at work in the lives of those that are his. And I want you to hear that out loud. Doesn't matter what denomination you are, it doesn't matter where you lived or where you're from, is that if you're his, if you have a relationship with him, right? There's been a time in your life, the Bible calls it a new creation, there's conversion, whatever, salvation, whatever you want to call it. The Bible calls it a whole lot of different things. If there's been that time in your life, then remember that you are his. And that the scripture says that he is at work in you, in your life, to teach you to trust him. And we'll do a whole lot of things in your life that helps you to grow and helps you to understand, and helps you to learn. Despite what you hear, okay, in your culture, all right, is that God's purpose for your life is not happiness. All right, I mean, that's what you hear all the time, and that's what. In fact, guys, we've gotten away a whole lot from who we were and the foundations of who we were as a country, and now, I mean, people's goal, if you ask them, it's their own happiness. The problem is that what makes you happy may make a lot of other people miserable, right? And so all of a sudden it becomes then your own issue and about me. And again, you'll see it all in a minute. But this is not who God's called us to be. And you're going to see that, and you have seen that in Abraham's life. It's actually really pretty cool when you think about it. You'll see it. If you've been here the entire time, I'm going to kind of do a little bit of review of the different things that Abraham's been through that taught him. And I just want you to kind of catch on to it. All right, so number one, if you want to follow along with us, number one is expect God to test, all right, to try, to test our faith. Because God, the goal for your life is to teach you to trust him. It's not what you can do for him. Why? Because he can get anything done he wants to get done. It's not so much, but it's learning to know him and to trust him, and all the things that go with it is what I've seen through the scriptures, right? So again, as we talk about this, I am talking to those that are his, to those that he is at work in, just helping us understand why sometimes some things happen that don't make sense. And let me tell you something, this does not make sense to Abraham. at the time he's walking through it. You'll see it in just a minute. So Genesis chapter 22, verse 1 says this, right? It says, after these things, God tested Abraham, right? So there's this picture of a test. And it's a test that causes us, it reveals to us where we are, and it also causes us to grow, right? And Abraham, and it said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. And he said, I want you to take your son, okay, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, okay? Now, the land of Moriah is a place, I have been there, and it's pretty much the exact spot, for those of you who have ears to hear, it's pretty much the exact spot where Jesus himself was crucified. And so you begin to see this parallel, which I'm going to talk about next week. You're going to see this parallel to what Abraham is going through. He's teaching Abraham to trust him, but also God's painting a picture of what's going to happen. And so it seems terrible, all right, that God would even ask Abraham to do something like this. But there's a picture here you need to see. So take your son, your only son, Isaac, and remember this guy, he'd been waiting decades. For Isaac to be born. And God had already made promises. So none of it made sense, right? None of it made sense. We'll talk about that in a minute, right? And so go to the land of Moriah. I want you to offer him, right, as a burnt offering, okay? One of the mountains that I'm going to tell you about. So this becomes a test. We've already told chapter 22, verse 1. And it was these things God tested Abraham. So this becomes a big one, right? But this has happened before, lots of times. And so I think the picture here is that God is at work in Abraham's life, teaching him to trust him, which shows us that if you're his today, God is at work in your life, right? Teaching you to trust him, right? And so I want you to see, just from what we've looked at over the week, some of the tests that Abraham went through, right? And maybe you'll see that you'll go through them, similar ones also, right? But here's some tests that Abraham encountered. And listen, some he passed, but some he failed. And I'll share with you just the ones we've covered here over the weeks, right? The first one is the security test. And that was at the beginning of Abraham's life. That is, what are you trusting in your life to keep you secure, right? Well, Abraham was from Ur of the Chaldees. And remember, if you've been here, if you're not, you can go back and read about it. But God called him out to a place. He was going to leave his family and his friends, and he was going to leave everything he'd ever known because God called him to a place that he wanted to give him. And so he left not even knowing where he was going, which is the book of Hebrews tells us about. So Abraham trusted God here. This is one of the first times he trusted God. And he left, right? Left everything that caused him to be secure. And he moved in the direction that God called him to, right? Another test that he went through is the famine test. Now, this is the test that he failed. All right, but I don't know about you, but I tell you what, I think in my own life personally, I think Abraham would probably agree, that where he learned the most was not when he passed the test, but when he failed it. All right, and we live in a world now, a culture where nobody fails, right? No such thing as a failure. But again, this is where you learn the most. But if you remember the famine test, a famine came into the land, which got Abraham fearful. What are we going to do? There's a famine, and I'm going to feed my family. How am I going to do all this? And so he kind of trusts in his own devices as opposed to trusting in the Lord. Remember, he went to Egypt. And after he made that decision, he made a whole lot of other bad decisions. If you remember, we don't have time to cover all of this, right? But eventually he wound up lying that Sarah was his wife and all of the rest and getting himself into trouble. And then he had to he came back. But he learned, right? Next time a crisis like a famine comes along, I've got to learn to trust God through it, right? Number 3 is I didn't know what else to call it, the selfish test, right? And guys, this is for some reason, God teaches this to those that are his. And the test and the thought is that this life is not all about you. In fact, as a believer, if you're his today, he is actively at work in your life teaching you that it's not all about you. Right? In fact, the scriptures are there. They teach us big time. Consider others before you do yourself. But that is a hard one to learn. Right? That is a tough one to learn. Abraham actually passes it. Right? If you remember the story when he and Lot separated, and he gave Lot the choice. And what did Lot do? Lot he picked the best for himself. And he wound up moving down to Sodom and really wrecking his life. And that's what generally happens to those who are self-centered in most of their decisions. Because a lot of times what looks the best is not the best, right? Again, you only learn that if you've ever been through some of these tests, you know? But remember, you don't know that you're in a test until after it's over, right? That's the bad part about it. If you kind of knew beforehand, then it would be easy. But anyway, so he passed this one. Lot failed it, but he passed it. And again, it's pretty interesting. But this is one of the tough ones, though, especially in our culture, because, in fact, it's the exact opposite. But it's how I can know. Here's another thing to remember too. But it's how I can know that somebody's a believer, because God is actively at work in you teaching you this. But remember this, all right? You're gonna fail, especially at the beginning. You're gonna fail a lot of this, many more times and then you succeed. I have found that most of your failures, they come when you're in your early years, right? As a believer, and that's how you learn. That's how you grow. And let me tell you, as a church, you know, as the church, you and I need to be patient with people who fail. Because it's the reason we're here, is to be a safe place for people to fail. Because it's how you learn, right? And yet sometimes believers are real bad about shooting people who fail, right? It's pretty amazing. That's not who he's called you and I to be, right? And everybody's at a different place. But anyway, Abraham passed this one. But this is one it's a tough one to learn, but it's an important one. Number 4 is the conflict test. All right, just the test of just being scared. If you remember, Lot was taken prisoner, and Abraham got together an army and had to set him free. And of course, Abraham had not ever been a part of anything like that, but it was a test of trusting God, even through conflict. Number 5 is the prosperity test. Now, this one sounds different, right? But I tell you what, this is the one that's the toughest to pass. I'm going to be gut honest with you, but we're talking to believers, right? We're talking to believers. But through the years, I have found very few people who can pass this test. Because a lot of people that can pass the poverty test, like learning to trust God through poverty. Why? Because you really got no other choice but to trust him. But I have seen it 1,000 times that believers who become prosperous, they get their eyes off God, either on themselves, on their stuff, on what other people think, buying what other people think. It's unbelievable. Very few pass this one. And I know that sounds strange to you, but it's the truth, you know, because we've got a whole culture of people who say they're believers, who they believe this to be, you know, this to be the ultimate end. I don't see it that way, because I think the Lord's taught me through the years that those that run out after this have a tendency of putting their faith and trust in it. And when somebody has a lot, the tendency is just to put your faith and trust in security and in your resources. But this is not who God's called us to be. And if you understand, if you've walked through this particular story with us, you remember Abraham's test was that after he defeated them, and had defeated and set, a lot of the people who were taken captive, the king of Sodom and a lot of the other places gave Abraham huge amounts of wealth, and of which Abraham wouldn't receive. But if you remember the story then I don't have time to go into all of it, but if you remember the story of Melchizedek, right? And Abraham tithed to Melchizedek. So in other words, Abraham struggled with a lot of things, but this one wasn't one of them, right? So he passed this one. And it doesn't seem, you'll see at the very end, that this doesn't seem to be one of those issues. Remember that these tests that you go through, a lot of times, what is a real temptation and a real struggle for others isn't for you, and vice versa. Again, everybody has different areas and different things you walk through for God teaching you to trust Him, right? But prosperity test, again, it's not an easy one. It's not an easy one to pass, right? It's not an easy one to pass. In fact, I know human nature in our world. The thought would be, well, Lord, put me through this test, right? But Lord, give me $1 million. But the great question is, guys, not $1 million, but what are you doing with the 100 that you have? Are you faithful with the 100 that you have? If you're not, then why give you $1 million? You're going to see this in Abraham's life a little bit later today. I don't know, it's interesting. If you're a believer here today, right? If you're not a believer here today, this is not going to make any sense, okay? But if you are His today, then see that God is actively at work in your life. Working, right? Number 6 is the patience test. This one he failed. If you remember, God had promised him, Isaac, promise, years went by. And if you remember, we talked about this. He and Sarah got impatient, and the whole Hagar situation, which led to Ishmael, which led to them trying to help God out, right? Remember? We talked about it a few weeks ago. And again, it wound up being a failure. But I think he learned, right? I know he learned through it and from it, right? And then number 7 is today, is the value test, right? What do I mean by the value test? All right, you'll see it today. Things that are valuable to you. And then the priority of how valuable those things are to you. What are the most important things in your life? And this can really help you too, to know if you're a believer or not. Because in reality, if the Lord is not that valuable to you, right, then you're probably not His. I mean, I don't want to be ugly here, but you'll see in just a minute. But value is different for everybody, right? What's valuable to me may not be valuable to you, but it has to do a lot with your choices. And what you choose is valuable, For some people, sports are extremely valuable. The other people, whatever, stuff, all kinds of stuff. Whatever, it comes up in all different shapes and sizes, right? But as a believer, God is at work in your life teaching you the things that really matter, right? Churches in general begin to really struggle when things that don't matter begin to matter. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. And you'll begin to struggle in your own life personally when things begin to matter too much, right? You'll see what I mean in a minute. All right, just a second. Now, so then value, right? Value. I brought with me today some pieces of art. You're going, you did, Jeff? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Let's see. Where is it? This one or is it this one? All right. I figure y'all figure it out. All right. Here is my art on canvas. On canvas. Now, it's signed, right? And it is a birthday present. Now, this one here is from my 2-year-old granddaughter. All right, pretty impressive. You see the handprint at the bottom? Probably not, but it is there. All right. And this one is from my 4-year-old granddaughter. Now, it's incredible how I could have said that it's an abstract art from some famous artist, and people would pay tens of thousands of dollars for it. But in reality, it's just a finger paint print, right? Finger paint print, Now, to you, this has zero value, right? But to me, it's got value. Does that make sense? So then value is something that is personal, right? And most of the time, we think things are valuable because other people think they're valuable. I was looking on Sports Channel a few weeks ago, and a baseball card was sold for $3.2 million. All right, now, is it worth $3.2 million? No. It's a piece of cardboard, right? It has no value except that it's valuable to people. And so in reality, it doesn't matter. And yet we start as believers, I'm not talking about those who aren't, but as believers, things start mattering that in reality don't matter, and it gets our eyes and our trust off of him onto things that are really pretty temporary. So as you begin to see today, today we're going to talk about this practically. Next week, we're going to talk about the picture of the gospel in these things. But today is going to make you rethink, if you're a believer today, right? If you're not, you're going to have a hard time making sense of this, right? But if you're a believer here today, then you begin to remember, okay, what does really matter? What is there that has real value? And not letting myself get hung up on things, right, that don't matter or that matter less, right? Therefore, am I going to bankrupt my entire life to have a baseball card? Now, we laugh, but if that's what you're into, right? If that's what's valuable to you, you're willing to sacrifice to be able to have it. For those of you who have ears to hear, right? All right, number 2 is trusting God even when it doesn't make sense. And boy, Abraham is in this spot. Okay, this one doesn't make sense, right? But we're still talking about things that are valuable, right? And so Abraham rose early in the morning, and he saddled his donkey, right? And he took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. Now, Isaac at this particular time, Isaac is probably, doing the math, some say 15 to 19 years old. I tend to think he's a little younger. 15 to 16 is about where Isaac is at this point, right? But listen to me, there's a feeling here you need to catch as much as the fact of what's happening. There's a picture you need to see, a picture in the picture, which we're going to look at a whole lot next week, that you don't need to miss. And so Abraham just basically follows what God says without it making sense. And he gets up the next morning and think about it as he's cutting wood. All right, put yourself, if you will, just a little bit in the emotion of the situation as you've waited all your life for this child, and God's made promises about this child, and now this doesn't make sense, right? And basically they got up and arose, and they went to a place which God had told him, right? And on the 3rd day, and I don't have enough time to tell you everything, but we'll talk about this next week. It is really cool, by the way, all right? Anyway, he lifted up his eyes and he saw the place from afar. And Abraham said to the young man, I want you to stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there and worship, and then we'll come back. So There are two things in the New Testament that Abraham is remembered for, right? And it's found in the book of Hebrews, right, in the New Testament. And the two things that Abraham are remembered for, number one, is when he left his homeland and went to a place he didn't even know where he was going, right? Just trusting the Lord. That's the first thing. The second thing is what's happening here. And I just want you to see it in Hebrews 11, verse 17. So this is New Testament, right? By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, there it is again, he offered up Isaac, and he would receive the promises. Who is the he? He is Isaac and Abraham, but it was coming through Isaac. And it was an act of offering up his only son, right? Of whom it is said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named, right? And Abraham considered that God was able to raise him from the dead. So see, Abraham went into this saying, okay, well, God's going to do something miraculous here because he's already promised that this is the one, right? And so he was able to even raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did. Now, obviously, the picture of the resurrection is where we're coming next week. And for those who have ears to hear, then just let yourself see this, because it is really cool, right? So we have then this picture of trusting God when it doesn't make sense, but also that God's painting a picture in a picture so that we can see. All right, number 3 is trusting God that he's going to work, right? Through a situation that doesn't make sense, that is based in the things that really matter, right? All right, so Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and he laid it on Isaac, his son. He took the fire and the knife and they both went together. Now, next week, notice here, I just can't help myself, right? Notice that they both went up the hill together, for those of you who have ears to hear. Also notice that Isaac carried the wood himself for his own sacrifice, for those of you who have ears to hear. We'll talk about all that. Next week's going to be real cool. Not that this week isn't cool, but you know what I mean. All right, here we go. So they both went together, and Isaac said to his father, again, the emotion, not just the facts, the emotion. Dad, he said, we got the fire, we got the wood. Where's the sacrifice? Right? And guys, again, we'll talk about this next week, but I want you to feel the emotion here. You have a picture not of who Christ is, not as much of who Christ is. It is a picture of Christ, we'll see it next week, but a picture of a father's heart and what he's going through. And it gives meaning for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Therefore, you were worth it. But the emotion of what was happening from a father's perspective is found here in Abraham's life. Guys, this is the picture that's being painted. For those of you who have ears, this is how God wants you to see himself in your life. It is a powerful thing when you look at it. And anyway, he asked, think about that. We got everything, but where's the lamb? And then Abraham said, God will provide for himself a lamb, all right, for a burnt offering, my son. So they both went together, right, up the hill. And they came to the place which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order, and it bound Isaac his son. Now, again, just one quick thing for you to remember. We'll come back next week, all right? But I'm telling you, a kid who's 16, a man who is 100 years plus, has no chance of binding a 16-year-old if the 16-year-old doesn't want to be bound. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? So the picture here is that the son trusted the father as much as the father trusted God. All right, for those of you who have ears to hear. Again, we're going to explain all this next week. Right? And so took the son, bound him, laid him on top of the altar, right? And then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife and to slaughter his son. And behold, the angel of the Lord stopped him. Abraham, Abraham. He said, I'm here. And he said, don't lay a hand on the kid, all right, or anything to him. For I know now that you fear God, saying that you've not even withheld your son, your only son. So the practical part is here is value, right? Abraham lifted up his eyes and he looked. And behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns, right? And Abraham went and took the ram. They offered it as a burnt offering instead as a substitute to his son, right? A ram with a crown of thorns, for those of you who have ears. Again, we'll talk about it next week. So Abraham called the name of that place, listen to this, the Lord will provide. Again, a verb tense. It didn't say the Lord did provide or has provided. It says will. So you have then this, again, another great picture which we'll pick up next week. So you have then everything that is thrown into this story and the parallels that comes to you and I. Now, number 4, joy. Joy comes from passing the tests, right? Right? Joy does, right? You know, and it says the angel of the Lord called Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I've sworn, declares the Lord, right? Because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son. I'm going to surely bless you. And will multiply your offsprings, the stars of heaven and sand of the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gates of the enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Again, this is a great picture of not just at the time, but also of eventually through Christ, all right? And so because you've obeyed my voice, so Abraham returned to the young men. They arose and they went together to Beersheba, and that's where Abraham lived. Now, so God just began to dump the blessings. But guys, by this time, God was able to trust Abraham with prosperity and all kinds of stuff, right? Because the thing that was most valuable in Abraham's life was the Lord. So God had no problem with, and all these other things will be added unto you, right? Seek ye first the kingdom, right? And so you have then this great picture. It's an amazing thing. You know, but this whole idea of tests, this whole idea of struggle, right? Sometimes it doesn't seem right? But it's taught throughout the scriptures. One of the toughest books in the Bible to read, there are two to me. The first one's Ecclesiastes. I don't know if you've ever read Ecclesiastes, but it is depressing except for the last chapter, all right? And you can read it if you would like. The second one is Job. That poor guy. If you've ever read it, right? The last couple of chapters are awesome, but it's just awful, the whole thing, right? And just one thing after the next. But Job made a statement toward the end. And it's one of those statements, one of those verses that you can't get it all by just hearing it the first time. It has to kind of grow on you. And you learn from it because it's got great insight. Let's take a look at it. Job 23 and verse 10 says this, but he knows, that is God knows, the way that I take. Those that are his. Don't forget that God knows exactly where you are. He knows exactly the situation that you're in, right? And he's not taken by surprise, right? He's not busy doing something else, right? And everything else I hear, right? But this is what Job is saying. And Job, who went through the fire, my goodness, if you want to read it. This was kind of his summation. He said, but he knows every direction. It says, and when he has tried me, tested me, I shall come out as gold. So what is Job saying here? Job is saying that basically, gosh, I don't enjoy the process, but I really enjoy the result. That's a huge statement from a guy like Job. If you don't understand the process, you find rock, you pulverize it, grind it up, stick it over the heat, the gold goes down, right? And then you scrape off all of what they call the dross. And then if you want gold to be purer, then what do? You turn up the heat. The more you turn up the heat, the purer the gold becomes. So there's a process that God is at work in your life that's compared to the process of gold. It's pretty neat when you understand what Job is talking about. Again, these things that happen, these struggles, they're things to really be understood as God works in our lives, right? Now, as I close, I just this whole thing, and these are some of the things that'll make you think. And by the way, I'll be holding an auction afterwards. But when I was a student pastor for lots of years, and I used to love to do something with students and then with everybody too. But basically what I would do is I'd tell everybody, take out a sheet of paper. Don't do this, by the way. We don't have time for you we actually go through it, right? But I tell them to tear it twice, right? And you have 4 pieces of paper. And I say, here's what I want you to write on these 4 pieces of paper. I want you to write on those 4 pieces of paper the things that are the most valuable to you, things in this life that are the most valuable to you, right? And to help, and I want you to do this mentally, and to help you decide what's most valuable, because it's real easy to try to be noble, but you're not fooling anybody here because nobody else knows but you, right? And I found the honesty of it, but I've come up with some questions that I think will help. Figuring out the things in your life that are the most valuable to you. And there are several questions. Number 1 is, what do you spend your time doing? Right? Time, unless you're extremely young, right, is your most precious commodity. Where you spend your time will determine the things that are most valuable to you, right? Doesn't matter if these things are worthwhile or even they have any worth. Value is not determined on those things when it's you personally, right? So what do you spend your time doing? Now, I'm not talking about like work, right? I'm talking about time that's your own. What do you spend your time doing, right? It's a great question to ask. You can say that your kids are of value to you, but if you never spend time with them, you're simply not telling the truth. Does that make sense? Okay, I think it does. All right, number 2, what do you talk about the most? The scripture says that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So you will generally talk about the things that are most important to you. In fact, it'll drive other people nuts at times, right? Like I have 2 children that are in the medical field. One's a PA and one's in pharmacy school. And when they come home, oh gosh, my youngest daughter just leaves the room, because they get into this science speak. Y'all know what I'm talking about? But that's where they're spending their time, and that's what they're investing in, and so it's become valuable, but invaluable to me, right? I don't need to know how you get there. I just need you to prescribe me what I need, right? So value changes, but you tend to talk about the things that are most vulnerable. So as you think, what do you spend your time doing? What do you talk about all the time? Number 3, finances. Rarely do we ever blow our finances on things that don't matter to us. So it's a good indicator of the things that are most valuable to you, because that's where you spend your money, right? And then number 4 is just thoughts. When you have time to think, right? What occupies your mind, right? So what you do is that you, from those questions, that take a sincere inventory and say, okay, what are the most valuable things in my life? And you put them on these 4 sheets of paper, 1 per paper, right? And so how I used to do it was I'd say, now put them in your hand. Now something happens, tragically or otherwise, and this one thing has got to go. And so I want you to take it and wad it up and throw it on the floor. Okay, you have 3, right? You know where I'm going. Eventually, one more is gone. And then the thing that's left in your hand is the most valuable thing in your life, right? And I'm talking to believers mainly. But those of you who aren't believers, you can learn from this too, right? But if what you're holding in your hand, if you can lose it, right? You're cruising for a bruising one day, right? Because there's really nothing in this life that's permanent, right? It's kind of like a major life crisis is coming if the thing on that last piece of paper is temporary. You know, when it comes down to value, I remember I was doing what I just did with you, but actually doing it with the papers, right? I used to do, before I came to you, right? I did a lot of chapels for sports teams. And when I was over in Tampa, we had a lot of the Bucks. So this has been lots of years ago, not recently, guys. I haven't done any of this since I've been here. But when I was there, we had a lot of the Bucks because of where we were. A lot of the Bucks attended our church. So I got to be friends, and they asked me to do different chapels. So I did a lot of chapels for the Bucks. But then after I'd done a lot for them, visiting teams would ask me to come do a chapel for them. So I've done lots. I've done Packers and Rams. And the one that comes to my memory the most is I did one for the Patriots. And I was doing what I did with you, right? Now remember, this is a chapel and it's not required. Now when I did them for the Bucks, you'd have, 40 or 50 guys in there, but this one only had about 12, right? And I shared it with these guys. And so I got done and I didn't hold punches, guys. I think that's why they like me doing the chapels, because I wasn't enamored by any of them. You know, some may have that trouble. I don't have that trouble. I have my own troubles over here, which I'm not going to tell you about right now, but that's not usually mine. And so if they're fellow believers, then I think they need to hear truth, like what is it you value the most, right? And I was done, and this guy came up to me. If I mentioned his name, you'd probably recognize him. And no, it's not Tom Grady, all right? And so, but he came up to me, and he was a little bit shaken, and he said, and he looked at me, and he had a God moment, not because of me, but just because something dawned on him. Because he turned around, I'm not asking anybody to show me their, but he did, and it had football on it, because he was honest. That's what he spent his time, his way he spent everything trying to do. And if any of you know anything about football, I mean, and it's gone, right? I know, right? 3 surgeries later, I know. It's gone. And now you're struggling to find out, who am I and what's my life all about? When the most important thing in your life is that temporary. That's why I say you're cruising for a bruising, right? But anyway, it kind of messed him, because he was a believer. There was no doubt he's a believer, because I asked him about all of it. But he says there's got to be some changes made, because this kind of stuff means way too much. And I was kind of taken back, kind of shocked a little bit, because a lot of people would look at what he had as something they would love to have. But in reality, you play a few years, people talk about you if you're good for a couple of more years, and then no matter how good you were after 5, they don't talk about you anymore, right? And all of a sudden, you're still trying to talk to people they don't even care anymore. And all of a sudden, this is what my whole life's been about. So guys, as believers, if you're not a believer here today, then understand you're not going to find anything in this life that's going to come through for you in here. That emptiness inside that no matter what you achieve never fills that place. But if you're a believer here today, guys, do you know how easy it is to allow things in this life to start mattering way too much? And all of a sudden, you start having struggles and crises in this life because the value of things isn't where it should be. It's called the value test. You don't even know you're in a test until after you failed it, right? And then you learn. And if you failed, guys, don't beat yourself up, right? Believers have been failing that one for a long time. The question is to grow, to learn. It's an incredible thing. The practical part of the book of Abraham is amazing. So as I close today, next week is going to be more of a picture of the difference Christ makes in your life, and it's going to be a little more celebrative because that's the picture of next week. But this week is more introspective. Me taking an inventory of what do I value the most. And guys, as you're a believer here today, you need to do it often because I can't tell you how quick it is to get things in your life that start to matter way too much. All right? God bless you. Let's have a word of prayer, and we'll have a closing song. God, thank you so much for your love for us. And God, thank you for what you're showing us in Abraham's life. I pray for the folks in this room. Lord, the ones that may not know you, that they'll understand what that means. But those that do, God, let us learn from the things that you put us through and that you allow us to go through and grow thereby. As Job would say, as we come out as gold. Again, if anything good's happened today, Lord, we know it's because of you. And Lord, we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. God bless you guys.